Hey YouTube, Decimate here, and welcome to my very first video on Raid Shadow Legends. Today I want to talk about Faction Wars, something that's definitely on everybody's mind now that we've all seen the info on Lydia, the new champion, and the race is off to get her. I say race, and Faction Wars is definitely one of those situations where it's a marathon and not a sprint. It's a slog. It takes a lot of time, and whether you're early game, mid game, or late game, it's going to be tough. Even if you've whaled out and you're super late game, it's pretty likely you're still going to have to 60 or at least 50 and gear some champions out that you never thought you'd have to, never wanted to for that matter. But that's what it takes to get Faction Wars done. Even if you've got teams full of Legos, in some cases it's just not enough. They don't have the right elements to get through the waves or to get through the boss, and you're going to have to try somebody else. So hopefully in this video I can share with you some tips and tricks on what I did to get through most of it. As you can see, I'm almost done. I've still got to 3-star Dwarfs 21, which is notorious for being extremely difficult and very gear and champion dependent. I don't have exactly who I need to get it done, but I've got a plan and hopefully that'll work out. Before we dive into the basics of Faction Wars, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my clan cluster, Dragon's Claw. I believe we have 13 clans now, ranging from hard, brutal, all the way up to Nightmare, Ultra Nightmare. I've got a number of top 100 ranked clans, and it's a fantastic group of people. One of the biggest recommendations I'd give to new players is to get into a good clan, an active clan. If they've got a Discord, even better. You can bounce ideas off people, get help with your teams, that kind of thing. It just makes the game so much more enjoyable. And you can have someone to complain to about the constant maintenance updates that we're getting. I can tell you right now that your mom and your coworkers don't care. So at least you'll have someone, a shoulder to cry on. Secondly, I'd like to give a huge shout out to a clanmate of mine, the Needless Mage. He's written an excellent guide for Faction Wars in PDF format. That's helped me and helped my clan out a ton getting through it, and I've bounced tons of ideas for builds, champion changes, that kind of thing for completing 21s and even earlier stages in Faction Wars. Sometimes some of the earlier stages can actually be harder just because you don't have quite what it needs to take out the waves, not enough CC, whatever it may be. So huge shout out to him, and thank you, Needless Mage. Maybe we can convince him to get his guide public so that it could be available for everybody. So let's talk about crowd control. That's your stuns, freezes, provokes, and sleeps. And I've also listed these roughly in order of effectiveness, with stuns and freezes being at the top, followed by provoke and sleep. Now, stuns and freezes completely lock down your opponents, and they don't get to take a turn, and if they do have one of their abilities on cooldown already, it actually prevents that ability from cooling down another turn. So not only are you preventing them from taking that turn, but they're also not getting that ability back for an additional turn since they were stunned or frozen. Now, stuns and freezes on an AoE basis are basically only found on your top tier legendaries and epic champions. So it's going to be pretty unlikely that you have one of those top tier legendaries or epics in every single faction that you're trying to do, and that's where gear sets come into play. And you can throw a stun set on any AoE champion that you've got, be it a rare or even an uncommon, and they become an MVP of that team. So stun sets are huge in Faction Wars, and they're probably one of the best sets to use. And I think that almost every single one of my factions used a stun set at one point or all the way through to 21. So stun is huge, but hard to get. So freeze comes next, and that's a very similar ability to stun. However, when an enemy is frozen, they do take reduced damage. That's not a huge deal, but it is something to note, and you will notice that you're doing a little bit less damage when you're attacking frozen enemies due to that. Provoke is a little bit more common on champions, and maybe not necessarily just relegated to your top tier legendaries and epics. One shining example of a fantastic provoke champion is Gnarlhorn. He's a rare for skinwalkers, and he makes that faction so much easier. He's basically a legendary for Faction Wars. He's got an AoE provoke, and he completely locks down the enemy team. If you've got him going fast enough, he can almost have them locked down the entire time. So shout out to Gnarlhorn. Other great provoke champions are going to be, say, Molly for the dwarves. Dwarves are extremely difficult, and without her, it's going to be even more difficult. You can also throw provoke sets on people. I don't have a ton of great provoke sets. Unfortunately, I wasn't saving those as early as I should have been to be able to outfit a bunch of people in provoke. But that said, provoke is awesome, and it's a little bit more available in most factions. The reason provoke isn't quite as effective as stun and freeze is because whoever is doing the provoking is still going to take the hits. Granted, they're not going to be, the big hits of the enemy's A2s, A3s, but they are still going to take some damage, so you're going to have to heal out of that damage somehow. I got sleep at the bottom of the list, just due to the fact that when somebody's asleep and they get hit, they wake back up. It also doesn't prevent their abilities from cooling down. And I find that when I sleep a bunch of champions on the enemy team, I'm hesitant to use my big abilities for the next couple turns because I want them to stay asleep. And sometimes it's just more trouble than it's worth. That said, it can be very useful if they are close to taking their turn and you can sleep them and avoid damaging them, then it's fantastic. It's just kind of a timing thing, so that's why sleep is at the bottom. I should mention fear as another form of CC as well. Anyone that's been on the receiving end of a Jack or Martial Ed in Arena knows that fear can be extremely effective as a form of CC, despite the 50% proc chance. Next up, we've got turn meter manipulation, which is kind of a subset of crowd control, but it's slightly different, and I thought it deserved its own section. Basically, what turn meter manipulation is allowing you to do is to take multiple turns per the enemy's one. If you've got your champions going at 200 plus speed, you're already going to be taking 2 turns to their 1 in most cases. And if you add on top of that some turn meter boosts or decreases for the enemy team, you might be able to take 3 or even 4 turns to their 1. Or, in the case of some bosses, completely lock them out from taking any turns whatsoever. Speed buffs and debuffs are kind of accomplishing the same thing, just maybe not quite as effectively as a straight turn meter boost or decrease would. Next, we've got healing and revives. And it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to completely lock down every wave of every faction and also the boss and never take a hit. So you're going to need to be able to heal out of that damage or revive a champion if they do go down. It's a pretty good thing to have on every single faction if you can get it, but some factions are lacking for healers, and sometimes it's kind of a balance between crowd control and healing. If you've got really good healers, maybe you can get away with less crowd control, and vice versa. This is one area where heal over times are actually pretty good. They're not quite as effective, for in-game farming of stage 20 dungeons, because you just don't need them. But in Faction Wars, the battles tend to go on for a little bit longer, so those heal over times can actually be really helpful. Even the small version can be helpful. I used Runic Warder on dwarves for a long time for that very reason. He's got a small heal over time, and it helped keep Molly topped off after she'd provoked everyone and taken hits for 3 rounds in a row. A revive champion also is extremely helpful for getting 3 stars on the factions. It's pretty difficult to keep everybody alive all the time, again, unless you've completely locked them down via crowd control and turn meter manipulation. So if you have access to a revive champion, they're probably going to be on your team if you can fit them in. Towards the bottom of the list, we've got buffs and debuffs, and that's not to say that they're not still important for Faction Wars. They are, but they're just not as important here as they are in other areas of the game. As far as which ones are good to have, it's going to be the usual suspects, your increased attack and defense for your team, and decreased attack and defense for the enemy team. I say they're not as important here as they are elsewhere because it doesn't really matter how quickly you get a stage done if you can get it done and get the stars, get your rewards, get your materials, etc. It's nice to be able to clear them faster, which all those buffs will do, but it's not 100% required. And decreased defense is less useful here if you've got the other bases covered and you can keep the enemy team locked down and you can heal out of any damage that you are taking. You can basically beat the stage, and it doesn't matter how long it takes. One other thing to talk about is auras, which are kind of like permanent buffs for your team. They can be extremely useful for faction wars. And also you might find that swapping out two of your team members that have different auras might help you get through different stages. Sometimes you want that increased speed to help your team go a little bit faster. Other times you might need to be a little bit more tanky, and you'll take increased defense or increased health, especially on the bosses that deal damage and ignore defense. Health is going to be gold, and defense doesn't matter at all. So if you've got a team that you're struggling on a stage with, try swapping out champions with different auras and see if that makes any difference. And last on the list is actually damage, which is a shocker, and it's different from every other part of the game. Damage is just not that important in Faction Wars. It is great to be able to speed farm those stage 20s or 21s, but it's just not necessary. And getting the stars is way more important, and you can do that with hardly any damage at all on your team if you've got the other areas covered. A great example of this is the first faction that I ever actually cleared, which was High Elves, and I did that with 4 support champions and Tyrell as my only damage. And at that point in time, he actually wasn't in the greatest gear. He was in a clan boss build, and I didn't have fantastic gear on him. But the fact that I had 4 support champions that were all healing and reviving and, you know, blocking out the enemies, it just worked. And it was a breeze. It was by far one of the easiest factions that I had to do. That can work elsewhere. High Elves are a little bit of a special case because they have so many great support champions. But if you're trying to throw in your arena nuker into a faction war team, more than likely he's just going to fall over every round, and he's not doing any damage when he's on the ground, and it's not really helping you in any way. So try taking that nuker out and putting in another healer or another CC champion. You'll probably find that you get a lot further in Faction Wars if you don't focus so much on damage and focus on other aspects. Now that we've talked about what abilities you're looking for your teams, let's talk a little bit more about how to gear them. There's 13 factions that you have to complete, so that's 65 champions total that you're going to have to gear, and not only that, it's going to have to be pretty good gear if you're going to get all the way to stage 21. That said, you can share some gear between them. You don't want to be doing that, you know, every day, swapping an entire gear set from one champion to another just to get your materials, that kind of thing. But if it's going to make the difference between you completing a 21 and not, I would say go for it. I had to share some stun sets, for instance, on a couple different champions, and you know that's just what I had to do to get 21 done. If you can then go back to having good enough gear on those 2 different teams to be able to farm stage 20 effectively, then all the better. But you may actually end up swapping some gear sets just to be able to complete some of these factions. Any gear is good gear if it's got good stats. Don't focus so much on completing sets unless they're vital. That goes without saying for the rest of the game as well. But you know, basically any gear, any sets you have on your champions that are already solid, they're probably going to work out fine. I just want to call out some of the standout sets from different locations in the game here. For Ice Golem, you know, you can use your health and your defense sets. That's not a problem. There are probably better options out there, but those are absolutely usable. Some of the standout sets from Ice Golem are going to be Reflex to increase the cooldowns of your skills. This is especially effective if you've got a champion that's only got, say, 1 cooldown that's important. They've got their A1 and their, you know, very impactful A2 that you want to have up as often as possible. Try a Reflex set on them. I don't have a lot of great Reflex gear. That's a set that I wish I had more of, but I just don't farm Ice Golem that much. Another set from Ice Golem is Taunting. Again, I don't have a lot of it. I wish I had more, but that can be extremely helpful. And lastly, we've got resistance, which really comes into play more for bosses when they're trying to true fear your team, and you want to keep somebody from being true feared so that they can either cleanse that off or something to that effect. High resistance comes into play in arena, but other areas of the game it's not that common. So it might be that you're a little bit lacking on that set unless you're super in-game, you know, in plat arena, that kind of thing. But it can be useful. Next we're going to come to Dragon. Obviously speed and accuracy are the two biggest sets in the game. Probably they're used everywhere. Probably the best, you know, general sets in the game, and that's no different than anywhere else for Faction Wars. Lifesteal, while being decent in Faction Wars, isn't nearly as good as you might think at first. You're not going to get those gigantic heals like you do when you're hitting Clan Boss, when you're hitting the mobs in Faction Wars off, you know, War Master and Giant Slayer procs. They just don't have quite as much health as the Clan Boss does, so your heals aren't going to be quite as big. That said, it can still be useful, and you know, if you've already got somebody in a great Clan Boss build and you're going to try to use them in Faction Wars, that's probably fine. Just don't expect those, you know, full heals off of every hit that you get a War Master proc on. Next up we got Frost. Frost is kind of situational, but obviously really good on any of your champions that are provoking. I've run Molly in a Frost set for ages, not only for Arena, but also for Faction Wars. I might have to switch that out for 21, but I'm going to see if I can get away with not screwing up her build too much. And then last we've got Daze. Like I was saying before, sleep isn't the greatest of debuffs, but it can come in handy. And if you've got a good Daze set, you know, throw it on someone every once in a while. You might get some clutch sleeps that will save your team and get you through a level. I believe the only person I have in a Daze set currently is Jack, and that's just because I had some really good pieces that I'd been saving for ages, and I hadn't used it anywhere else, so I threw out him for Arena, because you know your enemies are about to take their turn in Arena no matter what. So Daze in that case can work out pretty well. But like I said, for Faction Wars, not a top priority. Let's go to Fire Knight next. Stun set is the standout set for Faction Wars. So many factions are lacking, you know, really good CC at all, and you might just be lacking some of the champions that could provide it if you had them, but you haven't pulled them yet. So stun sets are gold for Faction Wars. Like I said, I've had to swap out some stun sets to complete different factions. Always trying to farm more good stun sets, but yeah, you know, the gear is a grind. Kind of a more niche set would be Frenzy, and I've only used it once or twice. I know I put Vrask in it to complete stage 21 for Orcs. Not a huge fan of Vrask, but the Frenzy set on Vrask actually worked really well against the boss stage. You know, every time he got hit, he got more turn meter, and he got to go a little bit quicker, and then got to heal the entire team up again. So if you've got some good Frenzy pieces, that one's worth a look. I wouldn't put it on a ton of people, but it actually came in pretty handy there. Then we've got the Regen set, Regeneration. And that one is also pretty situational, but again, lifesteal isn't as effective as it is elsewhere in the game. So trying to heal someone up who maybe isn't that great of a damage dealer to begin with, solely off of lifesteal procs, and you know, War Master procs in a lifesteal set can be pretty difficult. So you might find that a regen set actually does a better job, and you know, that can be super helpful on someone that you absolutely have to have stay alive, that doesn't really have a whole lot of healing coming from elsewhere, be it the rest of your team or, you know, a lifesteal set, etc. Savage is a nice to have if you can keep somebody alive on your team in a Savage set and they're doing tons of damage for you. That's great. It's not always easy to do. Sometimes you might find that it's better to just have that person in, you know, slightly tankier gear instead of just a Savage set, just to be a pure nuke. But if you can get away with it, it's one of the best sets in the game, obviously, elsewhere, and it can work in Faction Wars as well. Other sets worth mentioning are the sets that you're getting from the Forge now, and then also from Clan Boss. Immortal was actually pretty helpful in a lot of areas of Faction Wars. I didn't have too many people equipped in it before I started gearing people out for Faction Wars, but in Faction Wars, keeping that health topped off every turn is pretty amazing. Like I said before, the rounds tend to go for a lot longer, and if you can keep people CC'd, you know, for a couple turns and have that immortal set proccing every turn and healing up over those turns that everything's CC'd and you're not taking more damage, it's actually pretty good. It's not great for the arena because, you know, the matches are over so quickly, but in Faction Wars it can work out pretty well. Cruel set goes without saying, and you do more damage. It's great if you can get away with it. Then you've got your Forge sets, Perception, Swift Parry, Deflection, and Resilience. I think you could find a spot for all of those in Faction Wars. You know, a Swift Parry set on someone might be the difference between 3-starring and 2-starring a stage. So you can try that out if you've already got enough pieces made in the Forge, or if you're already in Plat and you've farmed a bunch of it, which I haven't. You can try that out as well. And then any of the Divine sets are going to be pretty good. You know, if you've got good pieces and you put it on someone, great. If not, they're not a huge deal. Another great set that's a little harder to get your hands on due to it being locked behind tournaments is the Relentless set, and you want to use that in a similar fashion as the Reflex set. You can put that on champions that have high impact abilities and they'll cycle around to them faster. It's a great set, but I would definitely reserve that for select champions that are going to have the most impact in it. That pretty much covers it for the basics. I'll be going into a lot more detail and covering more specifics when I do videos for each of the factions. Speaking of that, comment below on which factions you'd like to see me work on first, and I'll try to get those out as they come up daily. And also just ask any questions you might have down below. I'll try to get back to all those. And just as a quick sneak peek for one of those factions, I'll show you Ogryn Tribes. This illustrates kind of the points I was making earlier about how important CC is. This is a stage 20 clear in 2 minutes and 42 seconds, and it's basically just possible because of the crazy amount of CC that Gergo and Shatterbones are outputting here. Ignatius actually doesn't have any accuracy in his current build, so he's purely there just for damage. Honestly, Gergo and Shatterbones could probably solo this by themselves. As you can see, nobody even took a hit just based on the fact that they were completely locked down the entire time. So yeah, that's CC for you, and you don't need as much damage as you think you do if you can lock them down. So that about wraps it up for this video. Please like and subscribe. As I said, this is my first video, so every single like and subscribe is absolutely huge to me. Comment below if you've got questions, and have a good one.